on your praise. Our God is ever almighty. He's ever almighty to save. Yes, our God is ever almighty. He's ever almighty always. Fear doesn't get to sit on your throne. No, you won't share your glory. All the praise is yours alone. You are worthy, worthy. Fear doesn't get to sit on your throne. No, you won't share your glory. All the praise is yours alone. You are worthy, worthy alone. Our God is ever almighty. He's ever almighty to save. Yes, our God is ever almighty. He's ever almighty always. Yes, our God is ever almighty. He's ever almighty to save. My God is ever almighty. He's ever almighty always. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Abide with me fast, falls the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When change and decay. All around I see. O thou who changest not, abide with me. I need thy presence every passing hour. What but thy grace can foil the tempt?
Alrighty. Well, let's go ahead and get started with our Q&A tonight. Like I said, we have a good number of questions that we need to cover. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably read the passages, but if you need me to, so I've got 6 questions tonight, and a couple of them are longer, so I don't know how we're going to do on time, but I want to get to all 6 of these because we got some more for next time. So I'm just going to play the timing by ear as we go along, all right? But first, let's get started. Let's say a prayer real quick, and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you for tonight. We thank you for the chance to come together and study. We pray it'll be beneficial to us. We'll be able to learn the gospel more clearly and learn how to follow you a little bit better. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so we are going to start. We're going everywhere tonight, okay? But we're going to start with this question, all right? First question is, what is the difference in being spiritual and being religious? All right, so first off, I'm going to start off by saying, biblically speaking, there isn't as big of a difference as culturally speaking there is, okay? So you have a big push today to be spiritual and not religious. You'll see posts on social media or people talking about how it's a relationship, not a religion, and so forth. James 1:17 says that our religion is what we do because of what we believe. So pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and the widows and keep oneself unspotted from the world. So because of that, I don't think biblically there's as big of a difference, and biblically speaking, you're supposed to have both. But culturally speaking, because of the wrongs that have been done in the name of religion, specifically Christianity, and today, 20, 30 years ago, everybody was bringing up the Crusades or something like that. Nowadays, after the atrocities that are coming to light in certain denominations and things like that about how they treat their children or women or each other, or there was a big fallout after a large megachurch in the Northwest kind of imploded on itself. Now there's a bigger push to have spirituality and not have religion. But biblically speaking, they are the same, or if they're not the same, they go hand in hand. Culturally speaking, spirituality, there's kind of an emphasis on personal experience, on individual interpretations of Scripture, I don't believe that we need to do that, or that kind of goes into, well, I'm a Christian, but I'm not part of the church. I don't want to be a part of the church, and so forth. And then religion is kind of seen as this heavy-handed, organized belief system that takes advantage of people more than anything. So you'll have a lot of people when you're talking about giving, which we'll talk about tonight, or about the importance of coming to worship, which we'll talk about tonight. All those things are seen as religious, and the culture of today wants to go more towards spirituality, okay? But the problem with that is that just because the culture says the definition of a word does not mean that is what the biblical true definition of the word means. Okay? And so when you have people saying, well, I want to be spiritual, not religious, they're missing the point that spirituality is what we believe and how we act because of it. Religiosity, religiousness, however you want to say that, is what we believe and how we act because of it. So here's something I wrote down, okay? Culturally, there are issues with modern concept of spirituality over religiosity. Okay, here it is. Cultural spirituality forgets that there is to be a system of organized belief. It allows a flexible morality or ethics. It denies a need for all to be united in doctrine. And some would go as far as to say there is no doctrine. As long as you believe Jesus, as long as you have, warm, fuzzy feelings when you think about God, then that is, you're spiritual, and that's perfectly fine. But on the other hand, it also, I think there's an important need to talk about the fact that sometimes people are religious and not spiritual, okay? They're focused more about tradition more than doctrine. They're focused on formal practices, which is religion. While those things are necessary, those aren't the only thing. What happens if you come to church and you sing the words on the screen, you give more than anybody else in the building, you turn to all the Bible verses that I mentioned during a sermon, you bow your head and you are quiet while we pray, but you don't actually care to be there? Well, you've been religious, culturally speaking. You've been religious, but you aren't being spiritual. So biblically, we have to have those two things. When Jesus is talking to the woman at the well, he says, John 4:24, we need to worship in spirit and in truth. We do that through being spiritual and religious. All right, so that's the first question. Any clarification or anything like that on that one? Since I'm not having y'all read the verses, I will try to get your input if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that after the questions. All right, here's number 2. Did Jesus ever refer to the disciples as students or always disciples? There are only 2 times in the Bible when Jesus referenced his followers as disciples, okay? That's John 13:15 and John 15:18. Now, the word is used 238 times in the New Testament in the English Standard Version. Every time other than those 2, so 236 of them, it is the Bible writer referring to Jesus' followers as disciples. But here's the catch. You might have seen on our screens or out there, there is a Bible app called Methetes, or Methetes, however you want to pronounce that. It's done by World Bible School. It's a really good app, really good lessons. But they've tried to mix like a social media kind of thing with Bible studies. So you join a Bible study, a video Bible study, and you have people that you can communicate with and so forth through the app about the Bible study. It comes from this word Methetes, which is the word translated 238 times in the New Testament as disciple, okay? It literally means, the noun version means a learner or a pupil. The verb version, methano, or methano, means to learn or to hear, okay? So, it's basically a student. Someone who learns is a student, okay? Our word disciple, all right, so historically speaking, the Bible writers write the Old Testament in Hebrew and Aramaic. They write the New Testament in Greek and Aramaic. And then the first major translation of the New Testament was, or really, yeah, the New Testament, was into Latin, okay? It's the Latin Vulgate. So after that, every Bible translation, even if they go to the originals for references and for corrections and so forth, every English Bible translation was translated from the Latin. So, for instance, King James Version, they took the Latin Vulgate, they took the Textus Receptus, which were the manuscripts available at that time, and they went off the Latin Vulgate because Latin is an easier language to translate, and then they would go to the Greek manuscripts in the Textus Receptus, and they would make sure that their work counted. Okay, so they would double check their work, kind of thing. So the English word disciple comes from the Latin word discipulus or discipulus, which means a student, and the verb is to learn. So same thing, a learner, a pupil, a student, and then the verb forms are to learn or to hear. So when Jesus, the two times that Jesus calls his disciples, when he uses that word, he's saying student, okay? Essentially, culturally speaking in the first century, you would have all these rabbis, okay? So you notice a couple times the disciples or people called Jesus rabbi. A rabbi just meant a teacher. It's the Hebrew word essentially for preacher, okay? Each rabbi would have their students, their disciples, their pupils. Y'all remember, I think it was maybe last week or week before last, I mentioned Marshall Keeble had his preacher boys. That's what a rabbi's disciples were. They were young men most of the time that had gone through rabbinical training starting at the age of 13, and around the age of 17, 18 or so, they would leave rabbinical training, they would choose a rabbi, and they would start following that rabbi. They were his students, okay? So the word disciple just means students. Biblically speaking, in the context of the New Testament, the word disciple means someone who learns and applies what Jesus taught. But right now, sitting in this building, definition-wise, not literally, but definition-wise, because I'm teaching and you're all listening, you are my disciples, okay? Now, not literally, all right? We're all disciples of Jesus, but by definition, you're students, okay? All right, so any questions on that? Any clarification or anything like that? All right, we got a lot of questions, and I tried to put them in an order that would build off of one another, but they're kind of spread out. All right, question number whatever's next. What does the Bible say about how the church should use money collected for the church? All right, here's where we're going to go to some Bible verses. All right, somebody get 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4 for me, please. Somebody read that. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4.
Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you credited by letter to carry out your gifts to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me.
All right, can anybody tell me why Paul tells them on the first day of the week, I want you to collect funds, but then he says that there will be no collections when I come. What's he talking about? Why would he be worried that there's collections when he comes? No, that's a good idea. Ron, did you have something?
No, I was just thinking, because he wanted to go to Jerusalem,
Right.
he didn't really have a whole lot of time.
Right. So now he spent a couple months in Corinth after he wrote 1 Corinthians, okay? But here's the deal. There was an extended amount of time from the time he sent the letter of 1 Corinthians to the time he actually got to Corinth, all right? So essentially what happens, if you look in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, he gives more of an explanation of why, but in chapter 9 verse 13 of 2 Corinthians, he says this: by their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission, that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others. Okay? So essentially, if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and kind of Galatians, but he doesn't really mention it much in Galatians. But essentially, Paul is wanting to collect funds from the churches in the Asia area, Greece, Rome, so forth, because there's a famine in Jerusalem. Okay? So he sends this letter ahead to deal with all the problems in Corinth, and that's where he says, you need to fix these problems before I get there, kind of thing. A long time before he actually gets there. So when he gets there, he doesn't want, if they're going to give money to the saints in Jerusalem and to the famine in Jerusalem, he doesn't want to have to sit around and wait for them to gather all that money. So every Sunday, while they're gathered together anyways, they're already going to be giving. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But they're already going to be giving. And so he's essentially saying, when you worship, have a collection specifically for this Jerusalem need. And when you do that, when I come, I'm not going to have to wait around for y'all to gather 6 months worth of money to send to Jerusalem. Okay? So he does that eventually. He goes through through Corinth and through Rome and so forth. He gets that money, he takes it to Jerusalem. That's where he's arrested. He's then sent back to Rome after he appeals to Caesar and so forth and so on. Okay? But 2 Corinthians 9:13 is the important part here, okay? By their approval of this service. So he's talking about the Christians in Macedonia that gave above and beyond what they were able to give. He even says in chapter 9 that they first gave themselves and then they gave their money. And they gave so much that the people in Achaia were astounded by how much the Macedonians were able to give for this effort. Okay? So in verse 13, he says, by their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission. So he's talking about the people in Jerusalem are going to glorify God because of what you've done from your confession of the gospel of Christ. So our giving on Sundays is part of our confession of the gospel of Christ. It's not just to turn on lights or to pay the preacher or make sure the water bill's paid. It's a confession of it's our confession of the gospel of Christ. And the generosity from your contribution for them. Who would the them be? He says, I want you to gather money because there are Christians in Jerusalem that need money because of a famine. And when you do this, the generosity of your contribution for them, who's the them? The Christians in Jerusalem. And for all others. Okay? So that money wasn't just given to Christians, it was given to everyone that needed it, presumably until there was no money left, and then, that was the end of it. But, so the money that was given in 1 Corinthians did not just go to Christians. It went to Jerusalem to give funds to basically save people from the famine, okay? Christian and non-Christian. Now, that being the case, the early Christian worship was identical to the Jewish worship in synagogues, not in the temple. What did they do in the temple? Anybody remember what are some of the things they did in the temple? Sacrifices and so forth. Okay, it was not identical as the temple, but it was identical as the synagogues. So what would happen is whenever a city had 7 Jewish men in it, then the temple would decide, or the Sanhedrin would decide that it was time for that city to have a synagogue. So they would go and they would build a synagogue, basically a building kind of the size of ours. Some were smaller, some were larger. But there would be a bench around the edges where people sat. The person who was reading from the law would stand on a small raised platform in the center, so it would be kind of like in the round. And he would read from the law. That's where they would sing a cappella music. They would read from the law. They would pray, and they would have certain prayers that they prayed at certain times and so forth. They would also give. So this was not something that was strange to the early Christians. They were giving every Saturday. When Christianity started, they were giving every Sunday. Okay? And then the only thing that's different is, of course, the Jewish people in the synagogues didn't take the Lord's Supper because it wasn't established yet, and it didn't mean anything to them after the fact. So they were giving regularly anyways. But the command to give, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, specifically chapter 9, the command to give is for the church to give on the first day of the week, on the first day of every week. Okay? Just like they would have been taking the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week. Now, if you look underneath that, here are some things that the Bible specifically says the money from the church is to be applied to. Okay, 1 Corinthians 9, 13 and 14 says that preachers have the right to be paid. 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18 says that elders have the right to be counted of double honor. The word double honor literally is an accounting term for them. So it meant, and it even says, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. So essentially, if your elders are preaching and teaching and it's a full-time job for them, then Timothy is instructed that they have the right to receive funds from the church. Missionaries, Philippians 4, Paul writes to the Philippians and said, "You gave me money when I needed it." And then 1 Timothy 5, 13 and 16 is talking about widows, and it says, if they are widows indeed. Widows indeed just means they're actually widows with no family, okay? Is it possible for a woman to marry a man, to have kids, and then the man passes away, and the woman is left, but the kids are still around? Yeah, that's what usually happens, right? Okay, so essentially, the widows indeed in 1 Timothy 5, 3, it's talking about a woman whose husband passes and she doesn't have any kids. Okay? She's left all alone. There's no family to take care of her and so forth. And so the church funds could be used for that. Same with 1 Corinthians 5:16 with orphans. If they're orphans indeed. Okay, so that being said, here's something I want to stress on for just a second. If y'all will give me just a second. I know I've got a lot left to cover. I'm only on question number 3. But we have come in America, specifically America, we have come to this point in 2024, really it happened a long, long time ago, where the church is this institution that has money, and we all give to the institution, and so we're all down here and we're giving money to the institution, and the institution is here, and it only has the ability to spend money on certain things and do certain things and so forth. That is never the biblical definition of what the church is in the first century. When Paul writes to the Philippians in Philippians 4, he's talking to the Christians. He's not talking to an institution. When Paul makes the argument in 1 Corinthians 9 that the preacher has the right to receive funds, or the elders in 1 Timothy 5 has the right to receive funds from the church. The idea that the church is this thing that it lives separate and apart from all of its members, and it has money, and then the rest of the church, the church members are here, and we just we support the church. That's so strange to the biblical concept of the church. The church is the people. It is not a legal institution. We just had a conversation about this today. We're getting a new printer. It's time for our copier to be changed to next door. And he called me and he said, hey, because I signed the paperwork. Elders said it was good, so I signed the paperwork. And he called me today and said, hey, I got to send more paperwork. I'm really sorry. I didn't put the INC after the legal name of the church, and so our underwriters won't write the lease for the copier, so I got to send it again, and I added the INC. And I went, I'm a preacher, not a financial guy or not a legal guy. Hang on a second. So I called Gus and I said, are we incorporated? He said, yes. So it needs to have the INC. I said, okay, fine. And I got to sign the papers all over again. I was hoping I could get out of it. But that is the legal way that in America it works. That is not the biblical definition of what the church is. The church is the people that gather together, okay, that have identified themselves as members of a local church, local family, that then submit themselves to the oversight of the elders. It is not an institution, and our brethren that disagree with me on this call themselves non-institutional. My argument is they make the church an institution by saying that the church can only do certain things, okay? That brick is owned by every single person who's a member of this church. This mic is owned by every single person who's a member of this church. And to say that, no, this is the church's mic, it's not my mic, it's not your mic, this is the church's mic, is to make the church into an institution that the Bible never said it was. So, let's go a little bit farther. We can obviously see that church funds, if you want to call it that, church funds, were used to support various works of the church. We are commanded to be missionaries, but not all of us can go all over the world, right? So, Philippians 4, the Philippian church decided that it would take some of its funds and give it to Paul and send him all around the world, okay? We are commanded all to preach the gospel, but not all of us can devote their week to preaching the gospel. So Paul says he had the right, as a preacher, to be paid from the church funds, okay? But if that is the case, the argument stands that anything the church can do, its money can be used to do that work. We're commanded to worship, which means in America today, given our culture, it's really nice to have a building with some air conditioning and some heating and some lighting so people know where we come to worship. So we use church funds to pay for this building. Why? Because this building is an expedient to the command of worship. We have a microphone because not everybody can talk as loud as Lee. So we use church funds because we're supposed to preach and teach and pray and take the Lord's Supper and so forth. And in order to hear over our semi-truck air conditioners, you needed a microphone. So we use church funds to expedite the worship, okay? We are commanded to be benevolent, to take care of people. Therefore, it is perfectly acceptable, biblically speaking and logically speaking, to use church funds for that work. We've already seen 2 Corinthians 9:13 that money didn't just go to Christians. So the argument that non-institutional brethren make that can you see that this is something that really gets under my skin. The argument that the non-institutional brethren make that the church funds can only be used to support Christians. Why then does Paul not write them a letter of rebuke for what they did in Jerusalem when Paul says, people are glorifying God because of what you've done to them, the saints, and to all else, okay? If the church, which is not an organization, it's not an institution, but it's people, if the people of the church can do something and not be sinning, then the church funds can be used to expedite those things. All right, question number next. What does the Bible say about organized activities supporting Christians at church, i.e. festivals, fundraisers, etc., that bring Christians together? Okay, first off, fundraisers, we already talked about this. I'm going to take y'all's questions or comments at the end of this one. Fundraisers, the only biblical example that we have of the money to expedite any command, let me put it that way, to expedite any command, the money being gathered to expedite any command is on Sundays. 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. So fundraisers are not within that example. So I would argue that a fundraiser is extra biblical, that it is outside of the example and commands that we have on how we can gather money to then use for something else. Also, practically speaking, most fundraisers that are done by churches are supported by non-Christians. If you have noticed, this is something that we talked about ad nauseum when we started online giving. If you come to worship here, down there on the little thing, the little sticker in front of you, how to give is the smallest option available. And you don't see it unless you're looking for it. On the website, when you go to give, on every single page, it says non-Christians or non-members of our church are never asked to give a single penny ever to our church work. Online, says this, if you're watching the live stream, it says the exact same thing. I personally believe that fundraisers miss the mark mainly because they take money from non-Christians to do the work of Christians. But also, it's not authorized by example or by command in the New Testament. That goes to, we give on Sundays to do the work of the church. That being said, what does the Bible say about organized activities supporting Christians at church, i.e. festivals that bring Christians together? We have the command to worship together. We have the command to fellowship together. I'm going to argue that because we have the command to fellowship, now there is wisdom involved in this, but I would argue that because we have the command to fellowship, the collective funds of the members of our congregation can be used for that fellowship. We do that here. When you go next door and there's no bowls, it's because Lee forgot to buy the bowls. I don't buy the bowls, the church buys the bowls. We all buy the bowls. I just go to Sam's Club and pick them up. Cups, same thing. Water fountain, same thing. Still got to get cups for the water fountain. Just reminding myself. Okay, anyway, but we do that, okay? And I would say that the non-institutional brethren that have an issue with this do the exact same thing. They just do it at a different location. When we have a fellowship meal next door, we all come together, we spend our own money. We don't spend the church's money, but remember, the church's money is just our money too, okay? It's just a collective of our church money. But
The church's money ain't our money. Like, I don't give my money on Sunday and then say, I need a loan. I need $200.
it is your money and my money and Ron's money and everyone's money.
Once you give your money to the Lord, that's a whole different aspect, correct?
You're giving it to the Lord in your dedication. You're giving your money to the Lord in your dedication, but it is the collective's money. So something we do, which we have done in the past, we haven't done it lately, but something we do in the past that is we will say, back when we had men's meetings, we would get together and we would say, hey, so-and-so needs some help, or this, we've got something that this goes for, and someone would say, well, I don't feel comfortable with the church paying for that, so let's all just give. That's the exact same thing as the church paying for it, because all of us are giving to the church. And most of the time when you have a situation like that, those people who then give, say you give $20 or something, you're going to take that $20 out of the money you would have given Sunday, and then most people do. Not most people. Not everybody, but most people. But you're going to take that money out, and so it's the exact same way as the church doing it. The church's primary function in the New Testament is to be a collective of Christians. So when we give our money to the collective, then it needs to be, and our elders are doing a good job about this, it needs to be the collective's decision on where the majority of that, where that money is spent. Because it's all of our money. We're all part of the church. The argument that, well, the church's money is separate from all of ours, that's never found in the New Testament. Now, that being said, what you said about a loan or something, yeah, that would absolutely happen. If you were...
The thing I'm looking at, like when I sat down at the beginning and went through my bills, I don't have the church checking account and Michael's checking account.
Right.
You know what I mean?
But if you're short on your bills, what would you do? If you...
Work more.
All right, Michael Sizemore. No, but if you're hurting financially and you're a member of the church, what do? You go to the church and you say, hey, I'm hurting right now. I can't, I'm working as much as I can or something else. And then that money's distributed, right? Biblically speaking, I think the problem is we've gotten today to a point, I'm not going to get to the rest of the question. We have gotten to a point in Christianity in America where our culture has tinted the way that we look at the church in general. It's seen as this thing that is separate, which is why my argument is, which is why we have such a hard time right now with Christians being a part of a church, but they aren't part of the church. They show up on Sundays and they sit in a pew and then they're gone. You never see them again. They never talk to anybody. They're not part of each other's lives. They're not anything. But they got the church part done. And so now I get to live my separate life. If you were to ask the Christians in the first century, what is the church? They would have said all of us. They wouldn't have said it's that thing that's over there on Warm Springs Road. It's got elders. They make decisions and so forth. But biblically speaking, that money is all a collective funds to do the work of the church, whatever that work may be. If it's fellowship and we need something for fellowship or activities or something like that, there's wisdom involved there. You're not going to spend all the church's collective money on renting out, 1,000 bounce houses. I'm trying to think of some illustration off the top of my head, but there's wisdom involved there. But if the Christians can do it, then the church can do it, because the church is the Christians. It's not a separate entity. And that's my argument with non-institutionalism, is that it makes the church into this separate entity that can only do certain things. But that being said, fundraisers, I don't see any reason why anyone could argue that that's a biblical concept. But anything else on that question? All right, let's try to get one more in, and then we'll go from there. All right, can you explain Hebrews 10:25? I definitely don't have time for that last one. I'll get to that. I'll answer that last one next week, and we'll just push Bible class off. Because you asked the hardest question of the night. I'll give you the question, and y'all can go do homework while we wait for next week. All right, here's the easy question. Hebrews 10:25. Somebody read that for me, please.
Not neglecting the meeting together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day dawning.
All right, so can you explain Hebrews 10:25? Dalen just explained it. No, okay, so the word neglecting, I think the question comes from the word neglecting. Not neglecting the meeting together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. The day in Hebrews 10:25 has got to be the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? Hebrews is written to the Hebrew Christians who would have lived in Jerusalem primarily, okay? They are looking for this day that Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24 at the beginning of the chapter, not the end of the chapter, but the beginning of the chapter, Jesus prophesies of a coming day where Jerusalem would be destroyed. Okay? What's going to happen when all the Christians that live in Jerusalem are living there and they see the day, the end of Jerusalem drawing near? What does Jesus tell them to do? Run. Get into the mountains, get away, do whatever you can. When you see these things start to happen, you get out of Jerusalem. Because historically speaking, the Roman government would come in, they would besiege the city for, I don't remember how long they besieged it. They would eventually come in the north side of Jerusalem. Here's the Temple Mount, here's Jerusalem. They would try to besiege the Temple Mount. It didn't work, so they came in over here. They busted the wall. They came in that way. They went to the Antonia Fortress. They tore it down, and they tore the entire Temple Mount down. So everyone in Jerusalem was slaughtered in AD 70. There was not a single Christian, Josephus records, that there was not a single Christian that lost their life in the fall of Jerusalem. Why? Because Jesus told them when it was going to happen. He didn't tell them the day, but he told them how to see when it was about to happen. So they all ran. When you run, what's going to happen? You're not going to be around your fellow Christians anymore. You're not going to be able to encourage each other anymore. So Paul says, or whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, says, not neglecting to meet together as the manner of some is, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day that Jerusalem would be destroyed, drawing near. Because there's going to come a time when you can't encourage each other. And if you neglect, if you forsake, here's the definition of the word neglect: to leave behind in some place, to abandon, to desert, to forsake, or to leave. If you abandon or desert the gathering of Christians together, number one, you're not encouraging them, so you're not getting them ready for the day drawing near when they're not going to be able to be around Christians. And number two, you're not helping yourself, because there's going to come a day when you're not able to be around Christians. And then he says, Hebrews 10:26, if we sin willfully, there then remains no remission of sins, no sacrifice for sin. Meaning, outside of the context of the destruction of Jerusalem, neglecting the gathering of Christians together is a willful sin. And Paul says that if you willfully sin in this way, you're no longer a Christian. There then remains no sacrifice for sins, because you have turned your back on the church. You've turned your back on your fellow Christians. Now, can those people repent? Absolutely. But you're lost if you neglect, you leave behind, you abandon, you desert, you forsake the gathering together of Christians. Then the question becomes, is that forsaking one or two times? I was sick last week. The baby was sick for like a month. I couldn't get to worship. I had to work last week. They called me in late. They had some emergency. I had to work, or I had to do this, or, those sorts of things. Is that neglecting? Maybe. Neglecting is to abandon, desert, forsake, or leave. Do any of those sound like, hey, life happened and I couldn't get there? Something happened, I was sick? No. To abandon, if I'm saying, baby, I'm going to be home at 6 o'clock tonight, and hey, I have a car accident on the way home, and I don't make it home by 6 o'clock. Have I abandoned my wife? No, I had life happen. That's just happened sometimes. Bad things happen. Situations happen. If I say, hey, baby, I'm going to be home at 6 o'clock, but then one of my social media clients calls me and says, hey, I need you to get this done right now, and I don't make it home by 6, have I abandoned my wife? No, probably not a good idea, but I didn't abandon her, right? She's shaking her head. No. To abandon, desert, forsake, or leave means I just don't feel like going. I just don't want to be around those people. If you're making excuses, you're abandoning, deserting, forsaking your leaving. If I say, hey babe, I'm gonna be home at 6 o'clock, but then at 5:50 I say, oh, I really just don't want to go home. I'm tired of my wife. I don't get tired of my wife. I'm tired of my wife. I'm tired of my kids. I'm just going to stay here and work and say I had to work late. You're abandoning, deserting, forsaking, or leaving your family. If you are willfully doing that, also keep in mind, verse 26 says willfully, which means there are some times when it's not willful. Okay? But if you're willfully abandoning, you're just saying, I'm not going, and make up a reason. You might as well say, I got a hangnail coming out of the shower this morning, and I just don't, I got to go to the emergency room. One excuse is just as good as another. All right, next week, we're going to talk about this one. What are the major differences of the Jewish canon and the Septuagint? And then we're going to dive into 1 John next week as well. But I'm going to answer that one first before we get started with class next week. All right, let's go ahead and take a little break, and we'll get started here with the Devo here in just a second. Let me see here. Let me get this pulled up. He's reading blogs and YouTube, watching YouTube videos, and then saying, I don't know, let me answer. Septuagint? Septuagint. Oh, yeah, but I ain't got no cash. What? Becca, you got money? You got change for a 20? I'll buy 5 of them from you if you can find me change for a 20. Is Trip back here? Huh? Oh, they're $2 a piece? Well, what's the truck? I'll give that a shot. Dork. It was what? Why are you so dirty? Oh, wow. Well, you can if you need to. Okay. Alrighty, let's get started. Song number 911 will be our invitation song tonight. 911. Yes, sir. This one? Alright, that's fine. Just bring it back. We need it for next week, otherwise we're going to have to take up a special collection. All right, anyways, prayer requests. What prayer requests do we have tonight? Anybody have prayer? Yes, ma'am? All All right, D. Pollard, who is Miss Ethel's son, right? Miss Ethel's son has cancer surgery on Monday, so we need to be praying for him and for Miss Ethel. I'm sure she's stressing about it too, so be praying for D. Pollard. Anybody else have any other prayer requests? No? Y'all continue to pray for the people in North Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. It's almost getting worse up there as time goes along. I was talking with a person today who lives in the northeast corner of Georgia. They don't have power and they don't have water, and they told them that it would be 6 to 9 months before they got either one. And we booked their Airbnb, and she said, I mean, we got a generator, you can charge your stuff at our house, and then we got buckets of water. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna book us another Airbnb. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. I think the storm surge for the Panhandle was like 22 feet. So you can imagine, how high is that ceiling? So, you know, like one Josh from the top of that ceiling. So that's really high. So be praying for everybody, especially Kyle's friends down in Florida. Anybody else have any others? Alrighty. Invitation song is 9/11. Again, in case you missed it. 9/11. Lenny, it is all yours, brother.
Tonight, we had our question and answer. Very first question was the difference between being spiritual and religious. When I was thinking about doing the invitation and what I was going to do it on, I was thinking, and this kind of blends into that, I was thinking about how most of us these days seem to get our news and whatnot that we go for from social media. You know, anytime you have something bad happen, such as school shootings or such as we just had the hurricane come through, you start seeing everybody on social media that says, oh, look, this is a sign that the ends are coming, you know. Well, we have to make sure that we kind of keep the spiritual and the religious together, because so many people now don't want to be a part of religion, but they seem to miss reading the Bible at the same time, because when they see something like this coming through with the flood and they say this is just a sign that Jesus is coming back, they kind of missed a point to where when we had the flood, he said, I will never do that again, flood and to kill. You know, if they see something bad like the mass shootings, I don't think God intends on taking his creation to wipe out his creation. So people just kind of miss the whole point to where they want to say they're spiritual, but they don't want to be a part of religion. And that's the part that we have to kind of make sure that we keep together. We have to study. We have to know what he says for us to do. Because he says, you know, when he comes back, it's going to be like a thief in the night. We're not going to know when. We're not going to know how. So that's why we have to make sure that we're prepared and we're ready regardless of the time. So with that being said, if anybody needs prayers, want to be baptized, or just need anything else, you can come forward as we stand and sing.
Just do the first two verses. Bring Christ your broken life, so marred by sin.